Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today for this conversation about building bonds across generations. My name is Shauna Carey. I'm the CEO of IDEO.org. We're a nonprofit design firm that works with communities to ensure that their voices are central to the design of systems and services that impact their lives. And I'm also your host for today and moderator, I'm very honored to be. So why are we all here today? We know that contemporary American society is deeply age segregated. Youth spend most of their time in schools, while older adults tend to find themselves in retirement communities and senior centers, but we know that we yearn for connection across generations. And we see innovators across the country trying some old models, bringing some familiar ones back into our lives and building those bridges, and that's what we want to talk about today, how to create the connections that foster well-being and better health for everyone. So thank you for being here, and thank you to our panel. I'm thrilled to welcome three of those experts today. Right here, we have Eddie Gonzalez. Eddie is a writer, chaplain, and facilitator who's currently the director of engagement at the On Being Project. Any On Being podcast fans in the house?
Hey, all right, yeah.
I thought that might be the case. Welcome, Eddie.
I want to know everybody's favorite episode.
And thanks for bringing the hype. I really appreciate it. That was a good start. Okay. Yeah. Then we have Ayana Allen-Handy. Ayana is a consummate educator, everything from a first grade teacher to now her current role as a professor of urban education at Drexel University. She's also the founder and director of the Justice-Oriented Youth Lab, or Joy Lab for short, which wins my title this week of Best Acronym at the Aspen Health Festival. Thank you so much, Ayana, for joining us.
Thank you.
And on the end there, we have Marc Freedman. Marc is the founder and co-CEO of CoGenerate, and he's the author of the book titled How to Live Forever, The Enduring Power of Connecting Across the Generations. Thank you all for joining us. Let's give him a hand, shall we? Thank you. All right. So to kick off our conversation, I'd love to invite Marc on the end over there to help provide some context for this discussion. One of the really special things about preparing for this when we all met last week was so many of us had stories of sort of richly multi-generational upbringings with grandparents and nieces and nephews and uncles and aunts, or in my case, great-grandparents in our houses and neighborhoods. And yet the data tells us that America has never been more age segregated across the board. So I guess, Marc, I have two simple but probably big questions. How did we get here? And why should a community of health leaders be worried about that?
Well, just to pick up on your preamble about how we grew up in multi-generational households, and during the pandemic, my in-laws moved in with us, and I got very nervous. I think the world of them, but I'd been proselytizing about the virtues of multi-generational living, and now I was actually doing it. So it's worked out. So.
No?
I've been obsessed with this question of how we got segregated by age for about 25 years, and it came out of a project that was our founding initiative as an organization called Experience Corps, where we were mobilizing older people to work in elementary schools to help kids read by the third grade, and the program worked beautifully. But one of the confounding questions that came out of it is the older people and the students all lived in the same neighborhood. So why did we even? And the connections were so natural once people got in proximity. Why do we even need a program like Experience Corps? Why do we even need to intervene to connect generations? And the answer that I found is that's because we thwarted the connection at every turn. And we began the 20th century in the United States as arguably the most age-integrated society in the world. In 19th century America, and this amazed me, people did not even know how old they were. No, age was not considered it was would be like knowing somebody's blood type today. You'd never even think to ask. And birthdays weren't celebrated. Every aspect of society was integrated by age. It was an agrarian economy. Older and younger people worked together in the fields. Multi-generational living was the norm. It was very rare for somebody not to be in a multi-generational household. Even the one-room schoolhouse of yore had 4-year-olds and 40-year-olds learning the alphabet side by side. And then systematically, over the past 100 years, we turned that all around. And I think my main message in response to that first part of your question is it wasn't a diabolical plan or nefarious plan. A lot of the age segregation that we ended up with came about as the result of some of the most important treasured policy innovations. So child labor laws, universal schooling and young people, the invention of high schools, being congregated with other young people, Social Security. As I was saying yesterday, I think the singular triumph of American public policy, we had 24% youth unemployment in 1935. People were interested in getting older people out of the workforce to create more room for young people. So Social Security had that as part of its goal. And then we had this spectacular spree of social innovation that we invented senior centers, retirement communities, nursing homes, lifelong learning programs, all to solve the problems of the day. And the main problems that they were trying to solve were identity. It was a society that hated older people. So the idea of congregating older people with other older people, this was a time when we were enamored with youth. The older people were lonely and isolated, echoes of the present. So a lot of these efforts were to create community, and they were in need of purpose. And the purpose that we came up with was graying as playing, as leisure. So even though we were solving those problems in that particular context, we were doing it in ways that separated older people from the rest of society, that separated older people from the productive aspects of society. And as an end result, we finished the 20th century as the most age-segregated society. And it's feeding generational conflict, kids versus canes, okay, boomer, okay, millennial, ageism that runs both up and down the spectrum. If you don't have contact with people, it's hard to understand them. And, yesterday in the session with Deb Whitman, she talked about the happiness curve, younger and older people, but we're now starting to see a loneliness curve. The two most lonely, socially isolated groups in society are older and younger people, probably no surprise in a social organization that separates them. So in the end, and I'll just finish with this, is we changed the societal norm from generations together to generations apart to the point where it's something that is a bizarre and radical experiment that departs from all of human history, seems natural and normal.
Thank you so much. That paints a somewhat troubling but helpful context about how we got here. It immediately makes me want to talk about what we can do about it. So maybe I'll ask Ayana to jump in. I know that you're working in Philadelphia, right? And you at the Joy Lab and your team have come up with and designed and implemented a new housing model called Second Story Collective. And that is not only helping build some of those cross-generational bonds that Marc was talking about, but also addressing the city's housing shortage and gentrification challenges. Can you talk a little bit, first of all, about Second Story Collective? Tell us what it is, and also how you came to this work. Like, where'd it come from?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Shauna, for the warm welcome and introduction, and Marc for setting the beautiful context for this conversation. I'm really happy to be here with all of you today in community. Second Story Collective is a diverse, intergenerational, cross-sector community that is diverse in every possible way across age. We have youth, young adults, middle-aged adults, elders, pretty much from 7 to 82, working in community through community participatory action research. Second Story Collective really was born out of us sharing stories with one another and using our stories as the anchor for cohabitation and living together. In 2017, one of our members, Carol, was displaced. She found out that she had 2 weeks to get out of her home because the developer was going to be selling the property for student housing. Her landlord was selling it to a developer for student housing. She had two weeks to get out. And we all mobilized. We moved Carol and her family out. And that's when we realized we're all implicated in each other's stories. We're all implicated in each other's lives. And that was how the seed for Second Story began. So as Shauna shared, my background is education. My partner, Rachel, who is my co-conspirator in this work, and I'm just sending lots of love to Rach in the universe she is, currently battling ovarian cancer, and it is just about what this community is about. But I have to recognize that I'm not standing here as one. I'm standing here representing our entire community. And Rachel is a creative writer, and we came together around, hey, what can we do? And so in 2018, after Carol's displacement, we applied for an AmeriCorps grant. We really wanted to understand the landscape of gentrification and displacement in West Philly. We are located in Mantua, which is a promise zone. In 2014 was designated a promise zone through HUD, where 46% of our population lives in poverty, which is in comparison to 26% across Philadelphia. And every single social issue we have in Mantua. So a food desert, a lack of health care, even though, if most of you know about Philadelphia, it's a city of eds and meds, right? You have multiple anchor institutions, Drexel and UPenn and St. Joe's and Hospital of University of Pennsylvania, all these amazing institutions that are literally adjacent to communities that have been displaced, that have been culturally and racially displaced for many years. And so we really, our changing neighborhood was really palpable. We knew things were happening. Someone mentioned in a session, you see a Whole Foods pop up and you know that there's change happening. So we were seeing and feeling all of these things, but we had no real concrete data, so to speak, to support what we were feeling. And so this intergenerational team of, like I said, 18 to 82 said, you know what, let's create this project that is going to examine the landscape of gentrification and residential displacement, and also be able to see what is the landscape of affordable housing. So after 5 years of this critical participatory research, we discovered that up to 77% Black residents were being pushed out. We also discovered that there was what we deemed a sandwich effect, so that this rapid gentrification was happening from the north and the south in our community. And as artists are, we said, okay, we are going to use arts to really understand how we can make social change. So long story short, after the 5 years of that research, our program officers from AmeriCorps came to us and said, there's a National Science Foundation Civic Innovation Challenge. We think that your project would be really great for this opportunity. And so instead of just saying, okay, now we know what's going on in our neighborhood, we wanted to create a response. And so that response was, could intergenerational co-housing be an anti-displacement and aging in place strategy so that our neighbors could age in place and so that our young adults, college students, could be below market rent? And so we have partnered with our civic association. We have partnered with a Black-owned development company, Lomax Development, and we are developing a $65 million project that is an intergenerational community of elders living with youth, and we're all cohered through our stories, through the art, through creation of community quilts. We do a lot of things. So really, I know that was really long-winded, but Second Story is really looking at responding to what Marc was saying about the social isolation between our youth and our elders, and could this, experiment be, a response to that? So,
thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting. It strikes me that where Marc started is to talk about all these social programs that were designed to expand opportunity and have sort of inadvertently left us with the unintended consequence of a really age-segregated society. And I hear so much of expansion of opportunity and making sure that for our younger folks and our older folks that we're doing that again in this moment, but doing so in a way that is intentionally integrated, which is so beautiful. And also thank you for bringing Rachel into this space today. Eddie, I want to talk to you because I think you work at a really interesting intersection that I haven't heard come up a lot so far this week, which is the intersection of spirituality, storytelling, and well-being. And I'd love to hear, how are you doing that in an intergenerational way? How does intergenerational work come into the way that you think about that exploration?
Yeah, thank you. And I have to say, it's just a pleasure to be here. What an honor, what a beautiful setting. I feel a little bit weird on a stage because I'm so used to, in some ways, being in groups of people where what we do is we set the table, this is what we're here for, ask a great question, and then let the room talk. So to be here on stage just feels really weird. But
that's my job.
Exactly. I know. I won't take it. But what I felt when you said, when you talked about Rachel and how you are here also with a lot of people behind you, I couldn't help but think who all you all are bringing with you into this space. And when I think about spirituality, there's a way that you can think about it in terms of religion, and there's a way that you can think about it in terms of story, your experiences, the people who have known and loved you and that you know and love. So my spiritual background, I mean, I was a storyteller in terms of creative writing that became a chaplain in hospice. And I saw firsthand, I had a mentor that said, if you sit with people at the ends of their lives, they're telling stories because they're trying to make sense of where they are in this moment. They're trying to make sense of where they're headed, what they can do with the time they have left. And it was an incredible space to be. It changed my life. And it's interesting. I went from that to recording oral histories, tapping an old journalism background. I now work with On Being, doing these sort of conversational spaces about these big questions of what it means to be human, how we want to live, who we want to be to each other. And I have the privilege in some ways of like, there's so much broken in the world, but there's also so many great efforts that are happening. I mean, I'm obsessed with social creativity and people bringing together groups of people to do that work of sharing their stories, hearing one another, forming relationship. So I want to talk about this project called Nuns and Nuns that I got to experience firsthand. And basically what was happening, and when I hear about loneliness and when I hear about a spiritual hunger in some ways, part of the disconnect that I saw with Nuns and Nuns, it was a group that was bringing together Catholic sisters to meet with religiously unaffiliated millennials. So the nuns is N-U-N-S and then N-O-N-E-S. Basically, on a Pew survey, they said, what's your religious identity? And folks would check none, which identified a lot of millennials. And so there were these encounters where folks would talk about their sense of spiritual practice. They would also talk about what experiences they had had in their lives according to the intersections of their identities, how that was informing where they were trying to go. And an amazing group of people that are also doing social efforts, building communities in their own ways, and here was like a project that was nurturing them. I'm trying to think of what to say here, except like I'm so excited by how that has impacted young folks, in part because like for myself, I became a chaplain. I'm gay, my husband's here, and I became a chaplain in part because I couldn't become a priest or a monk in the way that I was navigating my own life. And there was a way that chaplaincy gave me a chance to provide spiritual care and also affirmed my own spiritual life. And I could step in then to spaces where folks who said, oh, I have no religious identity, I could ask them the sorts of questions to sort of say, well, what has your experience been? And yeah, well, in the context of hospice, you can die well in some ways. So for young folks to have a space where they could explore their spiritual identity alongside Catholic sisters who were in this place of their organizational life where their numbers were dwindling and they were wondering, how do we continue to sort of live out our call? These encounters opened up some amazing things. So two things really happened out of this, and one of them was that the young folks started to bring in organizational justice-oriented frameworks to say, as you divest of your property, if you put it on the market, we know who's going to buy it, and we know how injustice in terms of land ownership is going to play out. So what are the opportunities that we have to come alongside you to say, there are land justice options to reconsider like how you divest of your property in thoughtful ways. But then another thing that happened was there was web building that was happening, all the relationships. They said, well, here are all these amazing community organizers. What happens if we bring them together and tap into spiritual technologies like vows, or like a sense of, let's say vows, which is basically commitment. And you could say, what happens if we commit to 18 months together to forming relationships, being in conversation? And I could tell you more about this. We did all kinds of experiments together. And what ended up happening has just been incredible. We're now 3 years into relationship building. And I'll stop there and just say, excited to be here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's something really powerful in the spaciousness of what you're describing in Nuns and Nuns, like coming together just to be and to see, make space for what might happen. Yeah. So much of what the spaces we're funneled into have an implicit or explicit purpose and a set of goals and a set of achievements before us. And I'm so inspired by the idea of just choosing to be with people who are in some ways unlike you, but in some ways on a similar path, and like letting that become what it's going to.
Can I say something about that? Which is that I was also sitting down with an organizer recently from the Bog Center. So in Detroit, The James and Grace Lee Boggs Center is like a cornerstone of their organizing. And Rich Feldman, who's an elder there, he said, we oftentimes as organizers think we sit down at tables and we have to get busy building something. He says, but just as important, we need to sit down at tables and love one another, because what oftentimes happens is that something happens in the world and people pick up the phone. And that's how movement ends up happening. So, yeah.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I had the great privilege of collaborating with some of the sisters and my fellow millennials from Nuns and Nuns at the U.S.-Mexico border through my work at IDEO.org in the shelter network, supporting folks seeking asylum. And I think, on the face of it, that was my first exposure, and on the face of it, it sounded like a sort of unlikely bedfellows situation. But in practice, it was so clear to me that our yearning for service can create those bridges.
Totally. They've built communities that are international, and they've also built schools and hospitals. I mean, it's incredible what they've done. Yeah.
Speaking of service, Marc, I want to come back to you. There's a national conversation right now about youth service that a lot of us probably have been in. There are states and at a federal level conversations about what youth service corps could look like in an expanded way, about mandatory service. And I know you're really passionate about that service isn't just for young folks, and that actually service could bring us together across generations. Can you talk a little bit in more depth about Experience Corps, which you mentioned? What is it? How does it work? And what do you see happening as a result of the Service Corps exercise?
Absolutely, Shauna. And I just wanted to riff a little bit off of what Eddie and Ayana were saying. It made me think, a few weeks ago, I heard an NPR interview with Wendell Berry, the poet and philosopher, and I felt like he captured what we're talking about in the panel today. The interviewer was talking about her background. She came from a family, her parents were divorced, and Berry said, we live in an age of divorce where things that go together have been split apart. And then he went on to say, he said, what we can do is put two things together. Not all things, two things that go together. And I feel like that's what all of us are really trying to do. The old and the young, right? We're in a society where a quarter of the population's under 20 and a quarter of the population's over 60, and they go together, but they've been split apart, and it's taking these really creative ideas. And I think Nuns and Second Story Collective, the Friendship Bench, which we've been hearing about, I mean, they're such brilliant ideas. You couldn't make this stuff up in a way, but it captures the moment. And so service is a lot more mundane than that. It doesn't even have a great name, but that's kind of my root. We started this project called Experience Corps, as I mentioned, 30 years ago, and I'm going from here to the 30th anniversary gathering of the program. It's now run by the AARP Foundation. It's in 25 cities, but it started in the neighborhood where Ayana lives in Philadelphia. And one of the things that struck us about Experience Corps, first of all, the program had great research results, but it was also a loneliness prevention program. And I remember meeting this woman, Martha Jones, in Powelton, who told me the story of how she was an Experience Corps member working with these third graders, and she got up, and it was a cold February day in Philadelphia, and she decided she didn't feel well, she was going to stay in bed, but she forced herself to get out of bed and get dressed and get on the bus and go to the school. And when she was hanging her coat up, it's like an old 1920s school building, she described feeling these two little arms crawling up behind her. And she said, somebody loves me. And if she hadn't been embedded in this web of kind of interdependence, she would have probably stayed home and maybe even spiraled. But one of the surprises from Experience Corps, we had all the Experience Corps members were over 50, 85% African-American, Latino. But we had these young AmeriCorps Vistas who served in the program. And it wasn't part of a design or anything, but these beautiful things happened between the older members of Experience Corps and these young Vistas. And it just stuck with us. But it turns out that talking about age segregation and all these different spheres, national service is profoundly age segregated. 95% of AmeriCorps members are under the age of 24. 100% of AmeriCorps senior members are over the age of 55. They work in the same buildings and doing the same things on the same floors, and the twains don't meet. So we started this project called Generation Serving Together that's focused on bringing AmeriCorps and AmeriCorps senior programs together to show the unique power of the complementary perspectives. And Aspen's always been a place where these calls for national service, Aspen Ideas, General McChrystal called for universal youth service. I think we need a national service program that's intergenerational and that is suited and fitted to an age-diverse society. So I think somebody beyond me should get up and call for that at this gathering.
You're not announcing here that you're running for office, Evan? I love a big reveal. All right, well, I want to make sure to make some space for questions to the audience. So this is your 2 to 5 minute warning, everybody. Be thinking. I'm going to ask us to keep questions brief, and I'm also going to trust you to know the difference between a question and not a question, and I think you know what I mean. So be thinking about what you want to ask this group, but before we open it up, I'm going to steal moderator's privilege back for a minute. And I think I'm so inspired hearing about these individual stories that you're all telling about communities that are popping up and just sort of like reshaping the way we're living, but in a way that feels really aligned to who we are and sort of pushing the culture forward. And it makes me want more of them, and it makes me want everyone to have the opportunity to access them. And so if we zoom out a little bit to more like a system scale, I'm curious, maybe I'll ask each of you to just briefly address this. Like, what's one shift in our mindsets, in our culture, in our urban landscape, that in a policy sense that we need to make in America in order to enable more and more of these intergenerational initiatives to thrive and serve all of us? You can start, whoever's ready. I feel like, Eddie, you're giving me strong eye contact.
I'm ready, yeah.
Okay, great.
I feel like I'm coming in with the idea of the mutual exchange when it comes to intergenerational relationships. There's ways that people sometimes think, oh, well, like young folks coming alongside old folks, it's like, you're my mentor, I'm learning from you, and it only goes one way. So the redefining of elder, for me, it was really helpful to hear somebody say an elder isn't necessarily just defined by age. An elder is really anybody that's gone through something that they've come out the other side with some wisdom. And in that way, that's all of us through our life experiences, and we can both be younger and older, be teachers to one another, share our wisdom with one another. So that kind of reframing for me is huge.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's one shift.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there needs to be a shift in our dispositions towards these deficit framing of youth and also deficit framings of elders to more of this asset-forward approach that really looks at the assets that are embedded, the community cultural wealth that are embedded in both youth and elders, and then the power when they come together. I think also in terms of a policy shift is recognizing that youth and elders are empowered, not that we're empowering them, they're already empowered to make decisions, policy decisions about their well-being or about what they need. So they are active agents in creating the future and the lives that they want to have, and including them and having them at the table, like you shared, is essential for us to really move from this age segregated to an age integrated, intergenerational collective.
Great. Mark, what do you got?
Yeah, I'm so taken by that, and it makes me think of that loneliness situation. Instead of thinking of older and younger people as the primary victims of isolation and loneliness, how could they come together to be agents of change, to create more connection, not just with each other, but more broadly? I was going to say something different, but I'm so inspired by the friendship bench and this whole idea of the grandparent-grandmother role. Evolutionary anthropologists think we became humans in the first place because of the role of grandmothers who took care of babies while both parents went out and gathered food, and that enabled this long helpless period that helps us grow these big brains and become human beings. So essentially grandmothers made us human. And can we adapt the grandmother hypothesis to the modern family world? And through things like the Friendship Bench, or Finland has a program, a community grandparent program, where they're mobilizing older women and men to play that kind of role. I think there's enormous possibilities around. That's the thing I think that's wanting to happen. So how could we make it happen?
I love that. Grandmother's Made Us Human is going to be sitting with me for a long time. Like I should call my grandmother right now. All right, well, I want to open up to all of you to hear what you want to hear about. So raise your hand and then wait until a microphone gets to you to ask your questions so we can hear you and the folks that are going to be watching this can hear you as well on video. And please say who you are.
Hi, I'm Kenny Winchester. I'm Director of Strategy with the Humana Foundation in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm really curious about how you measure the effectiveness of your programs. Are you using evidence-based tools? Do you create your own tools? And how do you kind of codify the effect and explain that to community outside of your storytelling?
Okay. Yes, we have an evaluator on our project, and we have kind of worked with the evaluator to say that we want to center the type of multimodal methods that we use. So for our evaluator to also use art-centered research to be able to excavate what we're doing. Because a lot of times we're in the moment, right? We are eating together, fellowshipping, writing, creating. And so our evaluator really does have that outside view to really say, okay, are we effectively working towards our goals to be a transferable, scalable, sustainable model? Are we working, across the generations like we say we are? And so there's a lot of focus groups that happen with our team that the evaluators do, interviews, because we are currently in it. So the grant that we're working on is only 1 year, and we're coming up against like the third quarter of it. So we haven't gotten the results of that, but we do have an evaluator who is really helping us stick to our goals and to ensure that, we are who we say we are.
Before others add, I was supposed to say maybe one other shift we need is funding timelines that align to the kind of generational transformation we're after. So I'm just going to sneak that one in. Marc or Eddie, other thoughts on measurement?
Yeah, I'll just say we were fortunate with Experience Corps. There was a massive investment in research of that program. I started the program with Dr. Linda Fried, who's the dean of the public health school at Columbia and then was at Hopkins Medical School. So she led the research on older people, and then the Brown School of Social Work at Washington University did it on young people. And we essentially, it showed what Eddie was saying around mutual benefit. The young people's improvement in reading was equivalent to the benefits of half the classroom size by having these Experience Corps members. Some of the findings from Hopkins Medical School were stunning. They just came out with a paper, they published a paper showing that participation in Experience Corps reversed the preconditions of dementia. A lot of it was the social connection of being part of a team, the physical exercise, if I had to walk upstairs and do things like that. So that project has a very robust research base.
You've painted a very compelling picture. I feel like you should have a sign-up sheet on the way out for people.
Yeah, I might just add really quickly, too, that for us, a lot of it has come from story. I mean, at the end of 18 months together, we had 27 people that joined a community, and it was 25 said, I'm ready to commit to 2 more years. So even just that level of commitment. And a lot of it came from the experiments that we did. So what were the experimental containers that we made to hold the diversity in the room, to do the type of work that we did? And I think the funders that have been contributing to us being able to get together were like, keep going. They actually recognize, too, we know that y'all are just beginning, so who knows what will happen in 5 years and 7 years, that kind of thing.
Great, thank you. How about right here up front?
This is a question for any of you, but kind of for Eddie.
Yeah. Who are you?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Chris Gates, and I live in New York City. And
Great.
It's great to be with you guys. Yeah. Eddie, you said something earlier which was really interesting. You said you're used to having the room speak. You throw out a question, and then the room kind of gives what there is to explore. Can you share a little bit more about that, and what are some of the things that have surprised you in taking that process with a group?
Thank you for that question. A few things come to mind. One is that you can ask a question. So even in a room like this, having the question of like, what were you saying yes to when you came into this room, and letting folks share. It's amazing what you learn, what you hear, what will resonate, and what will be different. So even something as simple as that. But beyond dialogue, I'd say some of the interesting things that have happened were like we did improv exercises where we were like, we've been together for about 12 months. What are we going to do in the months ahead? we had an improv teacher who said, well, let's write down possibilities, but instead of speaking about them, we're going to act them out. And so we started just silently acting, and we got more accomplished, I think, in that 1 hour of not speaking but acting. And another thing that happened is we did these things where we did tell a story of care that you received that was really impactful to you with a partner. And your partner would listen to it, and then the invitation was like, now make a pose that symbolizes what you heard in that person's story of care. And so for me, I remember it was this. I did this for my partner's story. And everybody who had been telling stories stood up and walked around the room, and they said, I want you to see everybody as a sculpture of care. And we all got a chance to see different sculptures. I mean, it's like little things like that that were just powerful. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
How about right back in the middle with the sunglasses on your head? Who are you and what's your question?
I'm Angela. I'm Deputy Chief of Staff at HHS, Health and Human Services. Thanks for being here. We do a lot on, staffing ratios, creating rules around elder care and that sort of thing. And one of the challenges we always hear from the field is encouraging people to go into some of this work around caregiving, whether it's formally or informally, and the challenges around that. So I'm wondering, for the group up here, what best practices or thoughts you might have around those of us in government or in these types of structures as we're trying to set up a system that excites people, engages young people or people of all ages to go into caregiving and caregiving supports.
Who wants to take that?
A few things were coming to mind while you were saying it. One was really knowing their hunger. Like what's the hunger, and being really transparent about what the invitation is. That this is the purpose of our group. So we knew when I joined this 18-month community that we were going to dedicate ourselves to study, to some sort of contemplative practice, and so I knew what we were going in, and I knew why it mattered to the purpose. And if you can have people have like a good sense of, this is the invitation, this is the hunger that it's meant to meet, and also a good discernment. You don't have to say yes or no now. There might be like some initial meetings where you can meet some of the people that might come in, and you can start to think to yourself, is this where I'm meant to be? Is this the group that I want to join? So that when you say yes, your yes means yes, and you're in it, and the group you're with is committed to it
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind that I was asking Marc about earlier after his panel yesterday is the role of culture, and this may be outside the boundaries of HHS mandate, right? But I think one place older people have really disappeared from is a lot of our popular culture. I was sharing that I grew up with 4 great-grandparents within 20 minutes of my house. So to me, aging seems awesome. You're not working, your grandkids are around you. Several of those folks lived into their 90s. But that view of what aging can be inspires a version of what care for older people can be that is aspirational and exciting and joyful. And I think a lot of the expressions in our culture of what aging can be are not so joyful and not painting that picture. And so I'm curious about what we do in our culture to elevate the truth, which is that these multi-generational spaces are beautiful, and make that an invitation that feels a little more compelling. And also just like, we're all going to be in the business of care. It's part of being a human. It's also part of living in a demographically changing country. And so I wonder also how we can de-silo a little bit, like the formal systems of care and being a caregiver in that sense, and from a recruiting lens, and like the care we all practice in our lives and in our families, and what like more porosity between that could look like from a workforce perspective is something I'm curious about.
Yeah, and I would just say really quickly, just the reciprocity of it all. So if you're thinking and going into caregiving, you're thinking, I'm the one who's extracting, I'm giving, versus what will be received in return, right? So for instance, similar to Shauna, I grew up with great-grandparents, and my great-grandmother was 102. When she passed, she lived with us for 10 years. So even though there was caring happening, there was lots of lifelong learning happening. When she was 100 years old, she taught me how to crochet, right? We sit down, we crochet together, or we talk. So I think really emphasizing the reciprocity of it, that it's not going to be one-dimensional, that you also will be receive something in return.
And I'm seeing that in our multi-generational household as well. My father-in-law has Parkinson's, and my mother-in-law drives, our kids to soccer practice and music lessons, and our kids help with my father-in-law's care, and it's all interwoven as part of daily life. I was going to say, I wanted to pick up on what Shauna was saying about culture, because I feel like the three keys are imagination, innovation, and investment. And we have an imagination problem in this area. I mean, we think it's normal to be separated by age when it's anything but that. But I'm shocked at what's happening in the popular culture. I don't think we've started connecting the dots, but like look at, did anybody watch the Grammys this year? Yeah, you know, Tracy Chapman and Luke Combs, Brandy Carlisle and Joni Mitchell, even Billy Joel with that 20-year-old cellist from Iceland, I think. I just watched the last episode of Hacks, which the New York Times described as a love story disguised as a hate story, which I think in a lot of ways characterizes our age-diverse future. I mean, it's being seen as this hate story, but there is this potential interdependence. And so I think we're seeing Reservation Dogs as another just magnificent exploration. The Times called that a coming-of-age of all ages masterpiece. So I think there is a lot of usable culture that we're seeing in so many different spheres now that show us what coming together across these lines could really look like, what the benefits are, but without sugarcoating some of the challenges.
Absolutely. You had a question over here, I think? No?
Oh, yes. Are you looking at me? Hi.
No pressure if you've changed your mind.
I was like waiting for you to tell us we were done. That's why I didn't raise my hand. I
It's
appreciate
okay.
you.
I remembered you.
Thank you. My name is Hannah. I am the director of programs with the Loveland Foundation. We're a mental health organization that provides free access to therapy for Black women and girls nationally. And my question for you all, with our work, we serve Black women and girls 18 and up, right? The majority of the folks who apply for therapy support with us are between 18 and 35. And I'm curious from you all, what are some ways that you found success in calling in our older community members to make sure that they understand that these resources are for them, or to destigmatize the resources in the work that you're doing?
I love that question.
Great question. Oh, thank you.
We're going to let it wash over us.
I mean, I can speak from more of a just being a Black woman and my experiences, because I'm thinking about my great-grandmothers, my grandmothers, who there was a stigma around therapy or support. It was like, you show up and you don't let them see you sweat. So there's this cultural context that we're also reckoning with. But I think the more that we share our stories and we show up as our authentic selves. So in my grandmother's later years, similar to what you were saying, when my grandmother was also on hospice, she was 90 years old. And that's when I saw the mask come off in her 90s, where she could authentically say, you know, these are things that happened to me as a child that I do not want this to be a generational, you know, residue on you and the generations that come. And I think the more that we can show up our authentic selves and be in community with one another. And even I was sharing with Eddie, you know, on one of the projects that we have, my mother and my son are both active participants in it. And I see a more authentic version of my mother interacting with my son than what I experienced with her, because there's a certain cultural pride that Black women have. It's just embedded in us. And so I think the more that you can pull those layers off one by one and open up the space, I think it'll be powerful for all involved. What a great question.
Yeah, totally. I'll jump in on coming from the side. Yesterday in our conversation on aging, we talked a lot about our aching knees, and I could definitely relate to that. But it turns out that one thing that gets better with age, and there's a boatload of research about this, is our ability to form and maintain relationships. Laura Carstensen at Stanford has this theory called socio-emotional selectivity, but basically it's that as there are fewer years ahead than behind, people tend to focus on relationships. You just think, like, if somebody tells you have 30 days to live, you don't think, oh, this would be a great time to take up the oboe, you know, or I always wanted to learn Mandarin. You focus on relationship. And she's actually done studies, you know, with young people and given them these scenarios. And then it also turns out there's research that shows that the skills that are so important for empathy, emotional regulation also blossom in later life, and that, and particularly the ones that flow down the generational chain. So the relationships with young people are critical to happiness. Erik Erikson, the great psychologist, said that the hallmark of successful development in later life could be encapsulated in the phrase, "I am what survives of me." So I think leaning into this relationship blossoming in later life, I think, is really important.
I love what you said too about Ayana, about cultural pride. And it reminded me of a couple of things when you said it. One was that when I was doing oral histories with StoryCorps, when we would ask older adults to share stories, a lot of times they'd say, "I don't really have anything worthwhile to share." That would be almost like their default. And one of the things that we would say is, how about if we change the invitation, what stories might you want to share with maybe a great-great-grandchild who you haven't met and who you might not meet? But you want to share with them some piece of wisdom, some stories in the context of a gift. It sort of took it away from a sort of ego-centered approach to something that was about identifying with something that's much bigger. And intergenerational relationships spiritually really give us that opportunity to be in relationship with folks and touch a sense of time that is beyond just our lifetime. I mean, so yeah, how does this work connect with younger folks and connect with generations before me? And what healing can I do now for them? And also what healing can I do for my ancestors? Yeah, I feel like.
Thank you. More questions? All right, one right here, and then we're going to go back here.
Thanks. Thank you for this discussion. I'm Betsy Schwartz. I'm with the APA Center for Workplace Mental Health. And my question is, if you had a magic wand and could advise corporations and employers what to do to support the multi-generational needs of employees, what guidance would you give them? How to support what we're doing a project right now on the difference between what a 30-year-old needs from an employer versus a 60-year-old.
Great, thank you. And I'm actually going to ask, would you mind asking your question as well? And we'll have one person each ask them so we can hear them both. Can you pass the mic over, please? I'm hacking time.
Yeah, great.
Already.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Memuna Yusuf Kadri from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm a psychiatrist. And when we're managing patients, we always use what we call, the physicians in the room will attest to that, the biopsychosocial model. And this social model is so key because sometimes patients may go for their medication, go for their follow-up, but if the social support is not there, it's a big issue. And here we are talking about building bonds across generations. So I have this question, anyone can answer. So looking ahead, what do you see as the future of intergenerational relationships in our rapidly changing world? And how can we prepare the next generation to value and cultivate these bonds?
I love that. Great question. I'll do some of that. So I think we have two questions on the table. Marc, I might ask you to take a pass at the first one, if you're up for it, around what if we had a magic wand and we could encourage companies and workplaces to do things differently, what would we do? And then the second question maybe I'll ask you two to answer is around like what, sorry, say that one more time.
So social support is very key to our healing,
Yes,
everything. And we are losing that right now because of the kinship system is not really there. People are moving away, urbanization, migration. So the question is, looking ahead, what do you see as the future of intergenerational relationships in our rapidly changing world?
Thank you.
And how can we prepare the next generation to keep these values?
Okay, so future of intergenerational relationships in our changing world. Marc, you want to take a pass at the first one?
Oh, could I?
You can also take a pass at the last
on
one.
the first one?
Who has one piece of advice?
It's such a great question. I feel like we should try to find these places which are at the intersection of efficiency and humanity. You know, where we need each other's. So I'll give you an example. I went to this senior living facility in Cleveland where they had these young musicians. I talked yesterday about one in Phoenix, and this 94-year-old woman who was a big fan of classical music was living next to a 24-year-old violist. And the reason they had these young musicians there was because the older people wanted more musical entertainment, the young people wanted cheap rent. But so these two people are living next to each other, and they formed this deep bond. It started in efficient, and when the 24-year-old violist married another violist, they didn't invite Carla, the older woman, to the wedding. They asked her to be the maid of honor. and so where are these things where we can combine? So that's long-winded response.
Thank you. I mean, I'll try to do a two-pronged response that maybe could answer both. It's really one of the things we think about is moving at the speed of relationships. So even as young adults come into the workforce, it's really starting with story. What is it that's important to them? Similar to what you said, I love what you said about their hunger. What brings them into that space to begin with? And then thinking about the future. It's in my mind, this is the only way. Right? The only way for us to be is working in these intergenerational collectives and living and learning and growing and just being with one another. And I know it sounds cliche, but especially in my space as an academic, it is really frowned upon that we are really disrupting what people think academia is and who can have access to it. And this is the only way I want to do work is intergenerationally across all these axes of difference.
Yeah. I'd say important to a conversation. I'm thinking of a mentor of mine, Josh, who, when I was telling him about coming here, he says one of the worst experiences he had was people said, oh, we're going to invite people under 20, and so we're going to do alcohol. There'll be alcohol present. And how it was so cheapening that the idea that in order to get young people to the table, you offered them drinks. The same thing happens like pizza party, right? Like, when in reality, the invitation that makes the most impact is to offer substance and depth, give them the opportunity to ask really significant questions. What's broken? Where are you trying to meet needs? And what are the dreams that you have for the future? I feel like in terms of corporate, that matters. And I also feel like in terms of the future, what I'm seeing so much possibility in right now is a reconnection to what's really old. And when I say really old, I mean millions of years old, like reconnecting to land, reconnecting to the more than human world, reconnecting to the traditions that raised us. We're stepping into rivers of practice that have been generations. We're stepping into facing issues that have been generations in the making. And we are having to plant trees that we won't see because we're having to do generational efforts to fix things. So the reconnection with our past and the reconnection with a bigger sense of time for me feels like, essential.
Well, that feels like a perfect note to end on. Thank you. Thank you, Eddie, Ayana, and Marc, for sharing your wisdom with us today and your vulnerability. Thank you all for listening so intently and offering what you have brought to the room. And see you all around.
Thank you all.